Well, welcome to the Monroe County History Club again. You can think of it as a cooling station today. I noticed in the paper they're all over town, so it will be a cooling station here. Welcome to my wife Paulette and my cousins and my brother Steve over there. I left some sheets of paper on all the tables just with our programs that are coming up. You can take a picture of them, wad them up, put them in your pocket, whatever you want to do. But there's a few of them out there. Many thanks to the American Legion. I don't know what we'd do without them. There's really no place else we could host this than the Legion. They're perfect host for this. We've been partners in presenting and preserving local history for over 11 years now together. They offer us the absolute best venue for sure. Thanks so much to their wait staff. Please be generous with them. And the kitchen staff who do such a great job. Also like to thank Cats TV, our partners at Cats. There's Dave back there, our photographer, camera guy, he's great. They've been doing this for 9 years about. And it's a very important service for us. It allows us to upload each program to YouTube for people who can't make it to these live programs. And in addition, it allows us to have these great local history lectures to be put on display. The idea here is to preserve as much local history as possible, and CATS is perfect for that. They allow us to do that. Thanks also to our loyal history enthusiasts who come out on days like this, warm days, to watch our programs. You guys are much appreciated. The programs we present here are so diverse with many different subjects covered. We've had presentations on the stone mills and quarries, RCA, Showers Brothers, Monroe Lake, history of local post offices, on and on and on. So it's just great, all the different topics that we've been able to cover here. How many new attendees? We have any new attendees here today? Okay, a couple. If you want to leave your email addresses that you want to get on our mailing list, that's fine. You can leave with me, and that way you get on our regular mailing list. Some people aren't on Facebook all the time, like I am. So let's see. Now, the director of the History Center, Daniel Slagle, has a few statements he'd like to make.
Right. Thank you, Michael. I just wanted to come up and let everyone know we do have a new exhibit on display, Senior Chords Illustrating Identity. We paired with the Sage Collection at IU, and so we have both our senior chords that we pulled out, some of the pants, some of the skirts, and from Sage Collection. So that is now on display where anyone that came and saw the barn exhibit, that's been replaced by the senior chord exhibit. And next Thursday on September 5th, from 5 until 7, we're going to have a reception there. It'll be catered, and there'll be a presentation at 6 p.m., and everyone is welcome to come out. So please feel free, come out, see that new exhibit, and learn some fun stuff or relive some good memories. And then we also have an exhibit that's going up next Tuesday about the Woodlawn Court called Home Sweet Home, about post-World War II GIs and the housing. So that will be open in time. So next Thursday, the 5th, you can come out and see both exhibits at once. And then we have a lot of exhibits coming, or not exhibits, I'm sorry, events coming up in October. So next month, we'll let you know a bunch of the activities we have going on. We are collecting for the November garage sale. So I did bring flyers. We do have a garage sale on November 1st and 2nd at the same place it's been. So if you want to do some early Christmas shopping, feel free to go out there for that. And then in our store, we have all kinds of new items as well. I brought a lot of our spooky books for anyone that likes haunted or spooky readings, or some of the true crime. I just jokingly call it the murder and mayhem books. But if you like any of those podcasts, we have some books. And then we also have some new retro candy that we brought in for the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So I thought that would go well with the Senior Chords exhibit. So make sure to come by and see us over here at the table, or come out to the History Center. We're open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m. So I hope you enjoy the presentation as much as we're looking forward to it too.
Thanks, Daniel, and thanks for all the support we get from the History Center. I'll just mention a couple of the new programs coming up. The next one is September 24th, and that'll be a biggie. It'll be sold out here, probably 160 people. It's the history of university school, and they're all fired up for this. So we already did one on BHS, so we got to make things even out. We'll probably, and eventually we got one about Smithville, and that's in November. That'll be another big one, I think. October 29th is the history of Bloomington and Monroe County by Glenda Murray. She's the official historian of Monroe County. And those are the ones that'll be in the immediate future. But we're scheduled all the way through till next June, I think. For today we got John Summerlot. And John's given 3 other programs for us. This is his 4th one. They've all been great. He's a busy guy. He was at IU yesterday telling all the students where to go in a nice way, giving them directions on how to get to where they want to go, sitting out there in the heat. So good, great for him. That's cool. So the title of the program today is called Racially Restrictive Property Covenants in Monroe County, something I knew nothing about really. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what John has to say about that. So John?
Yeah, if you think freshmen are lost driving around town in cars, you should see them wandering around campus on the first day. Which tall building is what? They all look the same. So good times. Racially restrictive covenants, I'm going to talk a little bit about what they are, why they matter, and then I'm going to give some examples and talk through some of them and how this sort of has impacted the history of Monroe County and Bloomington in particular. So I'm going to start with this quote from Jim Madison. Some of y'all may know Dr. Madison, legendary historian here in the state. But he says, "We can't escape the past. We are prisoners of it. It is all around us, even if we don't know it." And so the reason I like this quote to sort of explain this is a lot of people don't know that these covenants existed or that these things happened in our history. Most of us, when we bought a house, I'm guilty of this. I went to the signing, they handed me a stack of paperwork about this thick, told me which pages to sign where, and I signed those. I didn't go back and read the deed. I didn't go back and read all of the details that were in that. And now I'm really wishing I have, since I started learning about this project and learning more about this, because it comes up as something that we don't necessarily know and we sort of lose in our history and we don't want to talk about it. And so we're going to do a little bit of that today. One thing I have to say to start us off, though, is a little bit about language. Layout, the setup of this room, I knew what it was going into it. There's some times that I'm going to have the actual quotes out of the deeds that are up here, and I'm going to read those, and that includes some language that we don't really use today. In that, and it's not language we like to hear and we like to use, but I'm going to say it because I want to make sure everybody can read it and everybody understands it because it's integral to the story, and I'll explain a little bit about why that is. So history quiz. Up until what year was it legal for the city, for a municipality, to say that people of certain races weren't allowed to live, my slides are getting ahead of me, weren't allowed to live in a certain area? Up until what year could a city say that? Hand in the back. Incorrect. So I know you know the answer. So 1917. So in 1917, there was a Supreme Court case based out of Louisville, Kentucky, where the Supreme Court said a city cannot tell people by race where they are allowed to live and not allowed to live. So at that point, it became a matter of, hey, if we want to make a racially exclusive neighborhood, how do we then make that happen? And the answer became property covenants, property deeds. Now, those of y'all who live in an area that has a homeowners association or something like that, you're probably familiar with property covenants. They require you to pay into a homeowners association. They require you to cut your grass or paint your yard. They require you to have a certain setup back from the road, those sort of things. But along the way, after 1917, folks started saying, hey, what if we build into these covenants that you can't sell your property to certain people, or that you can't build certain types of things or do certain kinds of housing on this? Does anybody want to guess when that became illegal? Heard somebody say it over here. 1948, those became unenforceable. Not illegal, but unenforceable. The Supreme Court said that if you have put in your property that African Americans or somebody else can't live on this property, that's not legally enforceable after 1948. In fact, it wasn't prohibited until 1968 when it became illegal to put new covenants in place on those properties. But that still left the remaining ones that were there before on those deeds and on those properties. Does anybody want to know what year they made it possible to take those off of your property, off of your deed? Oh, a lot of folks guessing late 60s. All the way back. Last year, right? And even then, it's a very, very convoluted process in order to get them off of your covenant, to get that removed from your covenant. So what we're going to talk about today is properties in town that people live on currently that have prohibitions about who is allowed to live there and why. And how that has sort of impacted our development as a community as we go through. So the question is, why does it matter? Well, the first is, it's impacted our community. Home ownership is a pathway to the middle class. It's a way that, we probably all consider our homes one of the things that we invest a lot of money and time in. I consider mine a heartbreak and a heartache, but, we do those, we think that's part of the process. The second is zombie laws. Zombie laws is this concept that there are things that are in the books that at some point somebody has decided to no longer enforce. And when it's no longer enforced, it's not a thing. We don't need to worry about it. But then somebody comes along and says, hey, you're not doing this anymore. I'll give you a great example of a zombie law that nobody knows about. And I love to bring it up because it makes everybody at the university uncomfortable. In the state code, in the state of Indiana, there is a loyalty oath that every faculty member at the university must publicly swear or affirm to, and it must be signed off on and recorded with the state. Now, how many folks in the faculty do you think have ever taken that loyalty oath to the state of Indiana and to none? As far as I can tell, the last time, this has never truly been enforced, but the last time anybody even mentioned it was somewhere in the 1970s, in the late 70s. But it's still there, and if somebody comes along and says, hey, why aren't you doing this with the faculty anymore? Then suddenly it becomes a means of, hey, these faculty can't teach, or these administrators can't be here. They haven't done this loyalty oath, right? So that's how zombie laws work, and that's why they matter. If they're still on the books and they're still out there as enforceable, somebody comes along and decides to enforce them in some way. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, removing covenants is tricky. You can imagine what this opens up if somebody says, I don't want to pay my HOA fees anymore. Or this property was promised that it would always only have one house on it, and now I want to build apartments, or some other sort of covenant that was written into that property. People are real sensitive about what that means and what that means for their community and the development pieces if we start removing covenants from property. So we'll talk a little bit about some of these as we go through. Covenants, they're an agreement between two or more parties concerning property. There's affirmative, which is things that you have to do, you have to maintain, you have to take care of. The other are restrictive, things you can't do on your property. You can't have farm animals, you can't have pigs. Now, some of that's also city ordinances, and city ordinances may say that you can't do some of these things, but then they may also be in your covenants as well. They're often done by a developer in the process of planning a neighborhood and then carried in every deed. So when that developer lays out that property and says, I'm gonna build 10 houses here, they plat it out, they submit it as an addition to the city, it then gets put into the records, and then each of their deeds will carry whatever restrictions were put on there. It can also be put on by an individual homeowner as they're subdividing property or doing that sort of work. They're not law, but they're enforceable via civil court. So in other words, somebody can come along and say, hey, you're not allowed to do, there's one exception to this that we'll talk about. It's actually an IU property. But for the most part, they are enforceable through civil court. Your neighbor comes in and says, hey, you're not allowed to rent to a fraternity. You're not allowed to rent to a sorority. That's what it says in your covenants. That says you can't do that. So therefore, we're going to take you to court over that. 1948, Shelley v. Kramer, Supreme Court declared racial covenants as unenforceable. Didn't say we could take them off the books. There were actually still some put on properties after that because people were hoping that they would be able to come back and enforce these after that. The Supreme Court would change their mind, or the Supreme Court would in some way reverse this decision. '68, Federal Fair Housing Act said that writing new covenants was illegal. And so '68 is the point when you couldn't put them on there anymore. So a lot of the work that I've done is based on two projects, both of which had the same goal, or to some extent the same goal. The first is a Bloomington Multi-Faith Alliance, their Faith for Racial Equity Committee, which goes oftentimes by this acronym BMA FAIR that you'll see there. And the other is the Monroe County Recorder's Office, specifically Jason Funk, who works there. Both of them, about the same time, started a project to go through and literally page by page look through all of the deeds in the county to look for these. So you can imagine the man hours that it takes to literally just sit there and flip through these deeds and read through them and look for this language. Both of them, in the end, produced a map. And these maps are available online. I'll have information about them at the end if you want to go look them up. They look a little bit different. This is the Multi-Faith Alliance's map. You can see here they've used Google Maps, and they've just sort of dropped icons on where those houses are. The County Recorder's Office one uses a little more streamlined software in doing that, and where you see the little yellow boxes and neighborhood pieces, that's the properties that they've done. And I'll zoom in on some of these as we go through this presentation. So here's an example. So this is Maxwell Manor subdivision, located adjacent to Bryan Park. Just kind of shows you how the maps are set up and how they look a little bit different. The top is the Multi-Faith Alliance map. The bottom is the County Recorder's Office map. And you can see here that all of these properties have some sort of racial covenant on them by the yellow that's indicated there. Here's another example. This is an area that we'll actually come back and talk about a little bit more. This Elm Heights neighborhood, Hunter and Atwater, just south of campus. So 17th Street from College to Kinzer, where there's a bank and I believe a soda distributing business. So the ownership and occupancy of lots and buildings or parts thereof in this edition are forever restricted to members of the white race, except that domestic help not of the white race may occupy a room in said dwelling during the period of employment. The right to enforce these conditions and restrictions by injunctions is hereby dedicated to the public and the owners of the lots in this edition. Right? So this is an example of the sort of language that you'll find in these. Now, the reason I'm going to read a bunch of these is because we're able to actually look at the language, and if you see a whole neighborhood that all has the exact same language, that's an indicator that the developer was the one that put it on there. As opposed to if this house says this and this house says that, those were probably individual homeowners that were doing that. In some cases. In some cases, it was also still developers, but they just were developing slightly different areas. But this gives us some means of tracking. And for me as a historian, this is what helps me track down some of the stories that I'm going to tell you today. So that's the reason I have a bunch of these up here with the language in them, because I want to read them. So I want you to understand that the language is what allows us to track them back. So this is Fee Lane on 10th Street, includes the Student Health Center, the O'Neill School, Wilcox House, part of Foster Quad, shall never be rented, sold, or leased to a sorority or fraternity or a colored person. This is written into those property deeds, right, that the university now owns. So here's another example. This is down off of Moores Pike and Smith Road, the Rolling Hills edition. Ownership and occupancy of this real estate or any buildings placed thereon are restricted to members of the white race. So 501 North Dunn Street, we're going to talk about this area very specifically, but 501 is this little house right here on the corner, right next to McCalla School. Shall never be sold, leased, or rented to any person of African blood or descent, usually spoken of as colored people. This is the language that's written into those, all right? So Maxwell Manor is right next to Bryan Park, subject to plat, of which ownership and occupancy are forever restricted to members of the white race. Pure white race, yeah. So Maple Grove's Baby Farm. We have a bunch of additions with Baby Farm in the name, by the way, which is a little weird to me in its own sense, but so anyway, Maple Grove's Baby Farm, out past Valhalla, shall never be deeded, leased, or mortgaged to a person of the Negro race. The King and Stenger Baby Farm, just to show this isn't just Bloomington, this is out towards Ellettsville, specifically says, shall never be deeded, leased, or mortgaged to a person of the Negro race. Now, in this case, King and Steger Baby Farms is also the subdivision, and if you go back and look at the very first deed, you'll find that the people who signed off the first deed, their last names were Stenger and King. So this tells you a little about who developed that addition and where it came from. And I was able to track down Wythe Stenger and Pearl King. Wythe had a daughter named Pearl, and so I'm assuming Pearl King is her married name. It sometimes shows up as Earl King. But they were the ones that deeded this property and are likely the ones that put this on there as well. What year? So this particular one, the first record that it shows up on is 1927. So this one, this is the Wiley Heights edition. So this is where Wilkie Residence Hall, whole area over on that side of campus is. So you've got Wilkie and Union Street, or 3rd and Union Apartments and some other things that are over there. The Wiley Heights edition, nor shall the same be sold to any Negro. This is the Wiley Heights edition, and an original deed came from Samuel Wiley, right? So whether somebody bought his property, named it that, or somebody put this into it, those are some real estate transaction pieces that aren't always real clear in that process. But we can do a little bit of development and learn a little bit about that, and I'll talk about the process that I've been going through with this. Why does this matter? So some of y'all may have heard recently that Green Acres is up for historic preservation. And so Green Acres has two communities, Hillsdale, which is down along 3rd Street, right kind of behind Red Lobster and stuff there. The ownership of occupancy of lots of buildings in this addition are forever restricted to members of the white race, and no person except members of the white race shall acquire title to said lots or parts of lots, blah, 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 except they can live there if they're a domestic servant, right? They have a second one, Highland Homes, which is on the far end of Green Acres, right over behind Wilkie. Real estate be not sold or conveyed to or occupied by any person or persons other than members of the white race. So they're up for historic preservation. They're before the historic board right now. So what do people say about it, right? So the Herald Times says, Green Acres neighborhood was established on a 160-acre farm purchased by abolitionist William Moffett Millen in the 1840s. From the 1920s through the 1960s, the area grew into a neighborhood with 467 land parcels. So me as a historian, I look at this and I go, wait a minute, we just jumped from 1840 to 1920. I'm sure there were probably some other people that owned the property during that time. What's the story there, right? Because clearly somebody came along at some point and added these racial restrictions, and it probably wasn't, although it could have been, abolitionist William Moffett Millen. So also, recent interim historic protection that went to that neighborhood, this is quotes from their document, has significant character, interest, or value as a part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the city, state, or nation, or is associated with a person who played a significant role. And it exemplifies the cultural, political, economic, and social or historic heritage of the community. I will let you make your own decision about whether or not racial covenants exemplify the heritage of Bloomington. As a historian, I will tell you they do, because there is quite a number of them, but what I would like to do is put a little asterisk on this that says that doesn't mean we agree with it, right? In a historic preservation world, there's a lot of things that people did wrong. There's a lot of bad things that have happened. How do we sort of build that into the history rather than forget it and jump from 1840 to 1920 when we do these sort of things? So that's a larger question than this presentation, but just to illustrate how we sort of forget these things. And now somebody comes along in 30, 40 years and says, what do you mean this neighborhood had racial restrictions? It exemplifies our history. Well, yeah, it might. So we're going to do 3 case studies. We're going to look at 3 things. The first is Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity and their houses. They are a historically black fraternity that was founded at IU. We're going to look at university courts. Those that aren't familiar with that, that's the houses just north of Dunn Meadow up to 10th Street. We have a lot of university property that's in that area. And then we're going to look at Smithwood. Does anybody know where Smithwood is? Nope. Well, sort of, it's close. It's Reed Hall, so it's a little bit over from that. So when Reed Hall was first opened, it was known as Smithwood, and we'll come back to that in a second. It also includes University West apartments or East apartments. I always forget which one it is that's right there. But so let's talk first about Kappa Alpha Psi. So I love these old neighborhood maps, the Alexander Addition versus Elm Heights. So the Alexander Addition, as you can see, is kind of outlined right here in the middle. Alexander Addition, Elm Heights is over here. If you look at a map today, for some reason, they say this is also Elm Heights down here. It wasn't at that point, although we largely consider it now. Why do I start with this neighborhood? Well, some of y'all may remember that I was involved in the restoration of the Alexander Memorial down on the courthouse square. In the process, I did a lot of research into Williamson Alexander, who the memorial is named after. And by the way, he's the one that created this addition. And so I've done a lot of work on this addition because this addition is quite possibly where most of the money for the memorial came from. So understanding the Alexander addition, big piece of the work that I did there. Alexander Addition was interesting because during that time, he was fairly progressive. He rented to African Americans and black students in the local community. He sold houses to women, which in the late 1880s was a little bit controversial, that he would sell property to them and allow them to build houses and support them, which wasn't always viewed as a positive thing. But he was doing a lot of that in the late 1880s through early 1900s to build the Alexander Addition. So the Alexander Addition is this big blank space to the left over here, and then right next to that is Elm Heights. So when Elm Heights gets put in a few years after the Alexander Addition, suddenly the Elm Heights neighborhood has all of these racial restrictions that are put onto it. And it was developed by the Elm Heights Land Company. I don't know who that was. I don't know who owned that. Haven't done the research on that one. But what's striking to me is the very first Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity house from 1914 through 1923 was right there on Hunter Avenue at 721 Hunter Avenue. So you have this neighborhood full of people of color, full of women that own their own houses and all of these things, and then you get a neighborhood put in right next to it where they say we are not going to allow people of color, we're not going to allow these sort of things to, these sort of people to live in our neighborhood. We're not going to allow women to own property. Most of the Elm Heights properties were not sold to women that I have found, that I've looked at least. So, you know, the idea that there's a wrong side of the tracks, right side of the tracks sort of thing really isn't that. Sometimes it's literally an alleyway, the right side of the alleyway and the wrong side of the alleyway as we go through that. So in working with Kappa Alpha Psi to research their houses, we know in 23 they moved out of there and they moved up to an area that we know, some of y'all may know today as Bucktown. And so Bucktown was a neighborhood that existed just west of the McCalla School from roughly 8th to 10th and across Indiana and Dunn. That whole neighborhood up there, historically, it was a low-income neighborhood. Historically, it was mixed in its racial population. There were a number of black residents who worked at showers. There were a number of black employees of IU that lived there as well. It was a low-income area. It was smaller houses. It was a rough neighborhood in that sense. And so in 1922, you get this plan to erect a garden city on the Bucktown site that pops up. And so there's a gentleman named Dr. Fred J. Prow who is leading this. If you've ever been up in that area today, you will know that there is a Prow Street that runs through the middle of what is today Bucktown. Now I'm dropping stuff. One too many pages. It's a little hard to read on the slide. So a couple of things about Bucktown that pop up in the news articles from that time period about the work that's going to be done there. This idea of city beautification comes into play. So property owners back movement to beautify city's ramshackle district, to build a garden city on the ruins of Bucktown. Now, keep in mind, Bucktown hadn't had like some massive fire or anything else at that point. They literally brag about the fact that they are evicting people from Bucktown so that they can improve the city's housing. And by that case, Proud gave notice to his 7 renters, 7 families that lived there, that they had to move so that he could tear down their houses and build 2 modern ones. So he's going to go from 7 families to 2 families, although the project claimed it would double the number of families living there as part of helping Bloomington's housing crisis. So I'm not real sure how evicting 7 families and putting 2 in, mathematically, I'm not a math major, philosophy and history, but I'll let somebody else figure that one out in that process. So in 22, this is right after that, this is another story about Bucktown. Bucktown and the University is the title on this one. This comes from the Indiana Daily Student. Just 2 squares from Indiana University lies a residential district that would look appropriate nowhere except for the forlorn outskirts of a large manufacturing district. The ramshackle district, known to everyone in parlance as Bucktown, is only an incongruous and unsightly anomaly in the midst of what should be a well-kept university residential district. And they go on to talk about the efforts, the men who will not sell. So not all of the owners in Bucktown were willing to evict residents and build new homes. Many of them wanted to keep renting to people. We'll talk about who those folks are here in a second. But they wanted to keep renting, keep doing what they were already doing and renting to the people that they were in that process. Old Bucktown to be cleared out soon. Handsome new homes there will relieve housing shortage. One of the quotes that comes out of this article, again, this is from IDS, from Indiana Daily Student. The most valuable section lying in the very heart of the city will become one of the beautiful residential districts in the future. The loyal citizens that are on board with this, and they use the phrase loyal citizens a number of times, are the ones that are building these new homes and building this new neighborhood in the Bucktown district, the loyal citizens. So that implies there's some unloyal citizens. That implies there's some people that aren't on board with this. We know who at least one of them was, and we'll talk about who that was here in a second. Lastly, the city says it has an immediate need for houses. This is an entire article that if I were to read it today, other than the language it uses, you would probably think I'm talking about Bloomington in 2024. Right? The whole article is nothing but there are thousands of people that we don't have enough houses. We don't have enough houses for new employees. We don't have enough houses for new faculty. We have mansions and then we have rental places and we don't have much in between and we need more of that, right? This is the whole article and this is in 1922. So in some ways, not a whole lot has entirely changed about town. So this is Bucktown. Bucktown's roughly this rectangle here in the middle. And Kappa Alpha Psi in 1923 starts moving into Bucktown. And over the course of the next 25 years or so, they live in various properties in Bucktown. And so some on 8th Street, some on 9th Street, some on Dunn. These 2 stars down at the bottom are, I believe, actually part of, I forgot the name of it, the Inn. Grant Street Inn, thank you. Grant Street Inn today, they don't exist. But 2 of them are still there. The one that's of most notable is 425 North Dunn Street. 425 North Dunn Street was very intentionally built in the late 1920s and occupied in the 1930s for Kappa Alpha Psi as a fraternity house. So there's a legendary IU employee. He was a graduate of the law school. His name's Samuel Saul Dargan. He was the first black graduate of the law school. He's also one of IU's first black professional employees. He served as librarian for the law school for the rest of his career. He was also a real estate investor, and he bought houses in this area. And because this Bucktown was considered a black neighborhood, he could buy houses there as a black man and then rent them to other black renters. So he falls into this category of the unloyal citizens that didn't want to turn over the neighborhood and destroy many of these places. And so one of the places that he built and then operated was the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity house at 425 North Dunn Street. This is a picture from their 1937 regional meeting that they held here in Bloomington. That's not all the people that lived in the house. The house only held about 20 or so residents. But this is a photo from their archives of that building. We've been back there a couple of times to verify that it's that building in that process. And so Sam Dargan and Kappa Alpha Psi, there are people actively sort of pushing against this idea that we're going to tear down Bucktown and build this new Garden City active neighborhood. There are people pushing back against that and wanting to work on it, which is why when you look at that neighborhood, you'll notice that they don't have, well, there's basically two areas. The first is Prow Gardens, which is basically a middle area right here, and then there's another neighborhood that wraps around the edge of it. They have the same restrictive covenants in them, but at the same time, you have individual property owners that are not doing that are very much pushing back against this and wanting to continue to rent to whoever they want to rent to without limitation. So you get this mixed neighborhood that pops up there. University Courts. So today, University Courts, by and large, most of this property is owned by Indiana University. I find it ironic that our LGBT Culture Center and our Latino Culture House are in this neighborhood, as well as our First Nations Culture Center, and the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. Collins Living Learning Center and Residence Hall is up here at the corner. Ostrom Workshop is in the middle here. So you get an idea of what neighborhoods, the one with all the brick streets, if you've been up on that side of town and you know the area. So what do we know about University Courts? Well, first off, it shall never be rented to a colored person or sold to a colored person. That's the language that's in theirs, and it's universal across all of their deeds. It was sold by University Courts Real Estate Company. So I thought, well, who is University Courts Real Estate Company? Maybe I can dig into that. Maybe I can find a little bit out about who that was. It was led by Thomas and Nettie Sayre. I already had somebody ask me. I don't know if Sayre Road is named for them. But Thomas and Nettie Sayre were local. Thomas Sayre was a local attorney, was very involved in real estate, did a lot of real estate development in the early 1920s throughout all of the area. The other partners in University Courts Real Estate were Eugene Perry, Walter Bradfute, Nat Hill, Fred Owens, Noble Campbell, and Charles Springer. So this was the real estate company that was putting this out there and developing this area. So who were some of the folks that lived there? Ward Johnson and Ellis Johnson from Johnson Creamery, Agnes Wells, the IU Dean of Women, Walter Allen from Allen Funeral Home, Paul V. McNutt, who was Dean of the Law School at that point, future governor, Joseph and Agnes Nury of the Nury Mirror Plate Company. So, I mean, these are that neighborhood was very much built as the neighborhood for Bloomington, for the people of 1920s, 1930s, the movers and shakers in town. Now, these are the people who bought houses here. They didn't put the covenant on or any of that, but they bought houses and moved into this neighborhood. So going back to the idea that we are cleaning up town, we are improving things, what we're building very often is what at the time were very nice, luxurious houses for the folks of town that could afford those. This was not a low-income neighborhood or student housing in any way, shape, or form. So Thomas and Nettie Sayre, they first lived at 705 East 7th Street, which is currently our LGBTQ Culture Center on campus. And then they built the house and moved over to 719 East 17th Street, which is Canterbury House Campus Episcopal Ministries. And so they lived in two different houses and built other houses within this neighborhood that they sold off as well. So part of the real estate, he would sell you the land, or he would build up the land, put a house in, and then sell the house and the land along with it as part of this deal. A couple other things I found about University Courts, a couple of my favorites. So this is from 1915. Arrangements are complete for the Howe Circus to give a performance at University Courts, right? So one of the things that real estate companies would do is they would try and get people to come look at the land. And to do that, they would provide entertainment and attractions. So in 1917, they start the sale of the choice lots that are there. And then in 1917, they also had a balloon ascension, one of our first sort of hot air balloon ride sort of things that happened in Monroe County, where the daring Miss Belmont, and I tried to find out more about her. There's no historic thing about this woman that apparently traveled the Midwest in a hot air balloon flying around. I would love to know more about her because she sounds fascinating. But anyway, she came and took off from university courts, and thousands of people were anticipated coming. Now, I know enough about how these things work. They say thousands of people. It's probably a couple of hundred people. But it would have been an attraction for that time to get people to come and look at the land and think about, do you want to live here? Do you want to build something here? Now, the best thing about both of these articles is nowhere do they mention racial covenants. Nowhere does it say, hey, by the way, this balloon thing, only white people can come to that. Instead, it says it's open to the public. Anybody can come. Anybody can buy land here. We know that's not actually true. Not anybody could buy land there as a part of that. So Thomas Sayre was also a prize tomato grower. This is another newspaper article about him. The reason I like this one is it starts off with, there is considerable friendly rivalry among the aristocratic residents of university courts, right? And every time you read a description of university courts, very often they will refer to it as the upper crust of Bloomington that lived in this neighborhood. And then in 1921, they note Thomas Sayre sold 2 properties in university courts to Allen, Misters Allen of Spencer, so 2 people named Allen from Spencer, in exchange for one of the finest river bottom farms in Owen County. He sold it for $32,000, which is about $500,000 in today's numbers. So when we're talking about what's the cost and who can live and who can move into this neighborhood, you're selling 2 properties with houses on them, $250,000 a piece or so, which in today's housing market sounds a little bit more reasonable, but a few years back would have seemed a little extreme. So Smithwood property. Smithwood's probably the most complex and the most interesting, and the one that drew my most attention, partially because I used to work in Reed Residence Center years ago. But Smithwood is today not totally along Eagleson. It's actually a little offset from Eagleson. There were houses along Eagleson at that point. But it at the time was the Smith's Woods, the Smith family's woods, hence the Smithwood name. This is a 1930 map of campus. You've got Dunn Woods down here, and you'll notice that, so here's what was then Jordan Avenue. Smithwoods doesn't even show up on a 1930 map of campus, right? Because we weren't quite there yet. That's not to say the university wasn't buying property and interested in it, but it wasn't quite there yet. So in 1920s, the Smiths started trying to sell the property. They knew what was happening. They could see this, hey, this is going to be a booming area for the university. The university might want this. Let's try and sell it to the university. They approached the university a number of times. They all got turned down. And then in 1936, they decided they were going to subdivide the land and sell it off as houses and housing plots. And when they did that, they put racial restrictions into those. They put what is quite possibly, it's definitely the longest that I've seen at least, but it's quite possibly the most complex set of racial restrictions into it of any that I've seen in Monroe County, because this is how long it is. The ownership and occupancy of lots and buildings in this subdivision are forever restricted to members of the pure white race. No Negro, mulatto, Chinese, Japanese, or person of any race or mixture of race except the members of the pure white race shall acquire title to any lot or building or part of lot or building in this subdivision. So on and so forth. Domestic servants are allowed only while they're employed. No deed, no subdeeds, no rentals, blah, 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 blah. This is the really fascinating part, though. The execution of said deed or instrument shall cause forfeiture, except as against a bona fide mortgage, to their successors or assigns of said lot or building, and thereto at once revert to said S.E.A. Smith and S. Edwin Smith, or their successors or assigns. In other words, if somebody violates this covenant 200 years in the future, the property immediately reverts back to S.E. and Edwin Smith and their descendants. So as some of y'all are having a little moment of like, I probably should have read my deed a little bit closer, right? What did they put in your deed that said somebody could just come in and take your property if you broke these? To reassure you a little bit, this is the only one I found. There may be others, but this is the only one I found where it specifically reverts ownership back to someone else. if these deeds are violated, right? If these covenants are violated. So as I said, the Smiths were trying to sell this property to the university. It didn't work out so well. They decided to make it an addition, the Smithwood addition. They platted it. They registered it with the city and the county. They said, hey, we're going to put this addition in. And then suddenly, in 1937, IU buys the land. And when I first read that, I went, like, we did? That seems bad, right? That seemed a little strange to me, didn't quite fit with some of the other things that I had read and that were going on with university property transactions at that point. And so later on in the process of this research, Alan Edmonds, who I am forever indebted to, in scrolling through the books, the deed books, ran across this statement that was entered in one of the deed books. Said grantors hereby waive and forever set aside any and all restrictions and conditions set out and included as a part of the plot, blah, 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 discharge and surrender all rights to declare forfeiture of said real estate for a violation of the restrictions, blah, blah, blah. In other words, the Smiths wrote a clause into sale of the land to the university that they would give up these restrictions and they would not enforce them. They can do that because the mechanism of enforcement was them. They're not surrendering anybody else's rights. They're only surrendering their own right to come back and reclaim this, as opposed to the other ones where it's neighbor on neighbor and other neighbors can sue you for violating the covenant. In this one, they're the ones that get the property back, and they say, hey, we're willing to take the money from the university and we'll sell it to them, and they can do whatever it is that they want with it. And so once this was found, it put my mind at ease a little bit. So December 1946, this is 48's when all this ends, but this kind of fits with the trend. The university was trying to buy some property in Indianapolis and own some property around it in Indianapolis, and a developer came in and said, hey, why don't you put racial restrictions, racial covenants on this property in Indianapolis? And the official response from the Board of Trustees was that requesting Indiana University sign a covenant seeking to exclude certain people from acquiring property in the neighborhood of North Meridian Street due to the fact that Indiana University is a state institution operating under the laws of the state of Indiana and serving all without discrimination as to race, color, or creed. We should not and could not enter into a covenant which would prohibit the title of property now held in our name from passing to a member of the Negro race at some future date. It's the official response from the Board of Trustees, right? So throughout this whole time, the Board of Trustees is saying, now, this is also the height of Wildermuth. Wildermuth is running the board at this point. So if you know anything about Ora Wildermuth, wild racist, lots of racist stuff, but he wouldn't allow the university to buy property that might restrict their ability to do things with it in the future. And so him and the board say, hey, we're not going to buy this property. And you see a lot of this back and forth in the real estate transactions. People are attempting to sell properties to the university. And all of a sudden it made sense to me when I would go to the maps and look at it, I would be like, oh, there was a racial restrictive covenant on that property. That's why the university wouldn't buy it from them. Even though sometimes it made perfect sense for the university to buy it and they were making great offers, the university wouldn't buy it. Now, obviously, there's some exceptions to this. We bought the land that Collins is built on, and I have yet to find any exemption or release from that. Some of the properties in university courts we did buy before 48, so it's not always a perfect system in that sense. Now, my point of pride, I guess a couple people asked Michael about this photo. In my research, one of my things that I enjoyed was in the process of tracking Essie and Edwin Smith. Who were they? What did they do? Why did they put this covenant on there? Was this just one of those like, hey, this will upgrade the property sales value, in our area, which was partially true. But I do know that Essie lived long enough to see Smithwood, now Reed Residence Hall, opened. And this is one of the very first photos from the grand opening of Smithwood Residence Hall. So there's a side of me that somewhere, Essie Smith was looking at this and going, oh, well, that didn't work, right? Because not only are we owning and renting properties in that area to people of color, we're advertising the fact that we were doing that. So there are two resources that are out there that I mentioned, the Monroe County Recorder's Office page, as well as BMA Fair's map project. There's links to them here. I put up QR codes. If you're a fan of those, I'll have them on the next slide as well, that you'll be able to track them and look at them. I'm also glad to post them in the Facebook group after this if people want to go look at them. This is the sort of thing where a lot of people really like the opportunity to pull up the map and scan around and look at the neighborhoods. And, you know, who did you know that lived in that neighborhood in the 40s, 50s, 60s? And parents had always lived there, you know, and those sort of things in the process. And I'm glad to share those with anybody that wants to look at them and talk about them. The other piece of impact that goes along with this is, you know, as we talk about how historically what is considered the black neighborhood in Bloomington has moved around. This plays a role in that as different neighborhoods have developed and people have set up property covenants and set up things to push them out of one area or another. This comes back to that. And I gave a lot of examples that specifically sort of focused on black residents and black homeowners, but many of the covenants also include sororities, fraternities, as you saw with the Smiths, Chinese, Japanese. There's even at least one I think I've seen that referred to Native Americans as not being, which I found ironic. They said Native Americans weren't allowed to own the property. You know, so as these sort of things progressed, you can search through the map, you can click on them, you can read the covenant and the wording of the restriction that's in it. There are a number of those out there with various restrictions and language. Oh, and that jumped off the end. Anyway. So racial covenants aren't a fun thing to talk about. They're not a fun side. I quote William O'Brien, former president of the university. We have to talk about the university's wrinkles and scars, right? And all the mistakes that the university has made or problems that it's had, because that's part of the growing pains. To know the university, to know Bloomington, to be proud of Bloomington, we can't just sort of gloss over this stuff. We need to understand how these sort of things have shaped our neighborhood over time. And I'll go so far as to say how housing in general has sort of, because housing is one of our big topics in Monroe County and Bloomington, and how those things have sort of shaped our community over time with who gets to live where, who's allowed to live where in that process. So I hope it's something you'll take away from this and be interested in, learning more about, following the link, looking up properties, those sort of things. Help spread the word, let folks know. As I told some folks earlier, my long run goal with this is I believe in our community and I believe in our university. We have a lot of smart people here in our community. We also have a law school and a public policy school. I feel like somebody might be able to figure out a way that we can sort of make it easy for people to get these off of their deeds if they want to go through that process to do that, and making it less cumbersome than it currently is to do that. So yeah, any questions? Yes.
What does that process look like?
Great question. So the question is, what does that process look like? I don't know if is anybody, do we know anybody that's been through it in the community? Yeah. Okay.
Recorder's office and file a repudiation statement and attach it to your property's history. Basically, you can go in and talk to Amy Swain and the crew in the recorder's office, and you'd file a repudiation statement that is just attached to the property's history. It doesn't necessarily remove any language from the history, but what it does is simply you are stating you don't agree with this. This goes forward after you file it. It stays in that property's history, that lot's history, and that's the best that the State House would do for us so far. That's not to say that they won't go back and revisit this issue, okay?
Yeah, and so this is a national issue. Folks around the country are trying to figure out how best to do this. Make sure I don't get feedback. Trying to figure out the best way to go about this, and there's a lot of legal questions and challenges as to how could we undo these things. So the repudiation statement is kind of the best that we've got at this point. So, yes.
If you want a copy of your deed, it's only $1 per page from the recorder's office. There are companies who will charge you more than $100 for it. but most deeds are only 1 to 4 pages, so stop by the recorder's office if you're interested.
So that was, if you want a copy of your deed, it's $1 per page from the recorder's office, and most deeds are 3 to 4 pages. So you can get one fairly easily. Companies will charge you much more than that to go in and do that research for you or to get it for you. Yes?
Find evidence of any stories about a transaction that was stopped because of a covenant or a sale that was rescinded?
Yeah, great question. So did I find any evidence of a sale that was rescinded or a transaction that was stopped? So the level of the research things I was looking at, that would be pretty hard to find because it would have had to have been a news story. Somebody would have had to have written about it. And this was a very, I mean, if you look back at the newspapers of the time, it was a very coded language sort of thing that people would put out there. This neighborhood is only available to the right people. Right? So if you go searching for things like, you know, racial restrictive covenant in a 1920s newspaper, you're not going to find it. It's not going to be there. So if somebody was not allowed to buy a property, it would have been a lawsuit. There would have been, you know, something that came out of that, and I've not seen any news coverage of that. Yes?
How would it be enforced if somebody sold a property that had to go back to the Smiths? Would that be enforced by the courts, or who would do that?
Yeah, so the question was, if the Smiths hadn't rescinded that, who would enforce that? Presumably the Smiths or their descendants would have to take the university to court and say, hey, or go to the county and say, hey, this is our property now because they broke this, give it back to us. I don't know that we had a lot of real great mechanisms for doing that, right? And it was kind of far out there to put it in that it specifically would revert to them. But yeah, that's kind of a scary thing that, you know, 100 years from now, somebody could show up and be like, no, I'm taking your property because you broke this rule that my great-great-grandparent put on it. So I don't know how courts would react to that. I'm not a lawyer. So, yeah. Yes?
Restrictions in the county, did you look at any of that?
Yeah, so deed restrictions in the county. So there are some. The Stenger and King baby farms was in the county at that point. There's a few others that if you look at the map, you'll sort of see them. Very often, land developer was saying, hey, I'm going to build a neighborhood here, and built it into what it was that they were doing. There are a few, but they're not nearly as common because a lot of this was about the university and about housing around the university. So 1910 through 1940, as much as people think the university has grown and expanded since World War II, that pre-war through World War II period actually is the greatest period of expansion in the university's history when you look at like percentage and size and all of that. The university basically quadrupled in size between World War I and World War II. And so you can imagine, you know, we haven't quadrupled in size in the last 20 years at the university. So as much as we're growing in numbers, that housing pressure of that time period really drove a lot of this, which made properties out in the county less likely to have these sort of things. Yep.
The deed books from the original county up to maybe 48 or into the 50s are all at the History Center.
Yep. So the deed books all the way up through early 50s, looking for confirmation, are at the History Center. That's actually how BMA Fair did their research, was sitting there and looking through those deed books in order to find them. And so that was their process for it. So you can also go back and look at those deed books as well. I will go ahead and tell you, having done it once or twice, learning to read property sales and deed books is a skill that I think probably defies most of the average human beings in the world. I am one of them that often gets stumped in that process. So have a guide with you when you go to do that. So I saw a question back here in the back as well. So
How does Monroe County compare with other counties? And I mean, is this like a thing anywhere else? Like,
yes. So the question was, how does Monroe County compare with other counties? Is this a thing elsewhere? The answer is yes, in that there are lots of other counties that are going through this process. This is actually a national sort of effort that is happening. It is community by community, though, and some communities are doing it and some communities aren't. It's very often volunteers. It's very often highly energetic and dedicated county recorder's office staff that want to put their time and effort into doing those sort of things in order to figure it out. And some people just don't want to turn that stone over. They don't want to talk about it, or the county doesn't necessarily want their employees digging too deep into this, and that's a job for volunteers or whatnot. So there are other counties and other communities that are doing this work, but it's not everywhere, by far.
So the Supreme Court, I thought, said that these covenants, restrictions, whatever, would be unenforceable. So doesn't that kind of, like, no one can really bring the lawsuit?
Right.
Maybe you could bring the lawsuit.
So the question is, if the Supreme Court said that they're unenforceable, could somebody bring the lawsuit? In 48, their language was that a race-based covenant was unenforceable. What is a race-based covenant, right? That could be a question that somebody could come up with, and they could say, hey, this says that nobody but, probably a better example, the Smiths with their no Japanese, no China. Japan is not a race in a legal sort of government definition way of that. So if you sold that property to somebody who was Japanese American, could somebody take you to court for that? The Supreme Court would then have to decide, is Japanese a race? Right? And so these sort of nuances of language and Supreme Court decisions and how they rethink things or reinterpret things over time is what a lot of people are concerned with, that there might be a point when they reconsider these things. At the same time, if they say these covenants aren't enforceable and a fraternity wants to build a house there, okay, is a fraternity still allowed to be blocked from building a house there? Or is that a municipal decision that the city needs to make about occupancy and all those sort of things? There's a lot of arguments that could come up from these to the Supreme Court about it, and nobody's real sure where that would go or how that would happen. I love to think that they are completely unenforceable, but that zombie laws idea that sometimes things that were done a long time ago come back on us in order to figure it out, and somebody decides to enforce something that nobody's enforced in forever. It'd be a lot better if we just weren't in that situation. And new ones, like I said, have been banned since '68. Some folks, I've had folks ask, are there any post 48? Yes, there are a few post 48 that are still out there where people said, ooh, I hope the Supreme Court changes their mind and stuck it in there. So, yes.
Did you run across any restrictions based on religion in Bloomington?
Restrictions based on religion. I can't think of any. I'm looking at Jason. No. Jason says no. I can't think of any. There's certainly, at that point in time, were some neighborhoods that were unwritten as if you are not a particular type of Christian, you can't live in this neighborhood. But those weren't written into the deeds. Yes?
States or national figures are pursuing this issue in a public way?
Any state or national figures that are pursuing this in a public way? Bernie Sanders?
California has legislation that forces the county offices to identify those and let people remove them or repudiate them.
Okay, so California has legislation requiring county offices to find them and let people know that they're there and allow them to remove them or repudiate them. Did I get all that right? Okay. And so there, again, it's kind of case by case basis as to who's taking it on. I know of one community, my hometown, down in Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama, where there's a group that's working on this, and it's actually being led by some of the city council folks. So I would expect at some point they're going to have some, but city legislation doesn't necessarily trump county property records rules. So we'll see where that goes. But, so. I got a smartwatch. I'm still learning how to use it. I feel dumb every time my smartwatch does something. So, all right. Anything else? So for those that are on Facebook, like I said, I'll put the links in the Facebook group if you want to get to them that way. You can also just Google Monroe County Recorder's Office. They have an amazing website with lots of amazing maps on it. I'm a map geek. I love to look at their maps. They have all sorts of things that are out there besides this, so check that out as well. But if you have questions, feel free to reach out. And if you saw a name up there today that you know more story on in some way, shape, or form, please feel free to reach out. I'd love to hear about it and love to know more. So thank y'all.